Hello and welcome back to Dear Dwyery, the show where I, Danny O'Dwyer, talk to developers about the games they make. Doing episodes based around new indie games is always fun because you get to dive into the developer's previous work, but I'm not sure I've ever interviewed anyone with the wild artistic resume of today's guest. Nicole He has just released Crush House, a game in which you work as a producer/camera operator for a reality TV show. In it, you're tasked with filming the various conversations, fights, and romantic interludes between the show's contestants. Nicole is creative director on the project, but much of the development work is being done by European studio Nereal, who were responsible for the popular mobile game Reigns and 2022's beautifully crafted Card Shark. Crush House is an incredibly unique experience, even for somebody who points cameras at people for his day job. But before we talked about the game, which will be available by the time this episode is out, by the way, I needed to talk to Nicole about the varied and bizarre oddities that pepper her resume, including one about an ejaculating penis. Don't worry, all will be explained. Okay, so I've had a lot of fun looking through the various pieces of software that you've worked on over the years. Of all the ones that you have up on your website, what's the one you enjoy talking about the most, and what's the one you enjoy talking about the least?
I love talking about the project that I would say launched my new life path, because it was a project I made in grad school like 2 months after I started learning how to code. And that project is the True Love Tinder robot.
A student at NYU developed a robot to Tinder for you. It has a stand in 2 places for each of your hands and makes the decision about whether to go right or left based on sweat. You can't lie with sweat. After all,
maybe still my best project to this day.
And this works by the subject puts their hands sort of in 2 little hand-shaped holes, and like sort of carnival game style, it like decides whether or not you're going to swipe left or right with like it's like a phone in a mannequin hand. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so it's a physical, robot is really a strong word for what it is, but right, it's a physical piece where you put your hands on these sensors and then it's holding Tinder on a phone in front of you, and you're looking at Tinder and it's calculating how sweaty your hands are through the sensors, and therefore determining with extreme scientific accuracy how attracted you are to the person you're currently looking at on Tinder. And then there's this rubber hand that will physically swipe left or swipe right on the screen. And then also the robot is making commentary on your involuntary choices, sort of roasting you in either direction.
Excellent.
Can you see yourself spending your life with this person? You're not very picky, are you?
What's the project that you don't like talking about the most?
I feel like you're going to know what it is if you've looked at my website. But then I end up talking about it the most because it is the most...
gratuitous?
Gratuitous, yeah. It's the gratuitous project. It's Soylent Dick. We need a volunteer. We need somebody who wants to receive Soylent in the face. If you do this, you will win a free bag of Soylent. So don't be shy.
Not joking, it's not expired either.
Does anybody want to be the volunteer to receive Soylent in their face? I've described this before. I've justified this in my defense. I made it with my friends, Catherine and Chino, at a hackathon called the Stupid Shit No One Needs and Terrible Ideas Hackathon. That's why we made Soylent Dick.
This question may have been constructed to get you to talk about Soylent Dick without me having to ask. And if people want to know more about Soylent Dick, they can go to nicole.pizza, I guess, and check it out for themselves. So tell us a little bit about how you came to work on these projects. Like there's a great number of, would you call them games? They're pieces of software. Some of them are physical. Some of them are you can play and download online. I really enjoyed the one that where I had to use a microphone to sort of zoom in and enhance sort of
computer.
Yeah. I've always wanted to do that from watching people doing it on television shows.
Yeah.
So to be able to actually gamify that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that project actually, I think, represented a sort of transition in my creative practice in my career as well, because it's something that does bridge that gap between weird tech art project, which was the kind of stuff that I was doing before I officially went into video games. So my journey here is a little bit unusual, I guess, for game dev. So in college, I studied journalism, and then after college, I went to work at Kickstarter doing community management related things and talking to a lot of creative people about their creative projects, including people in the games industry. And I actually became friends with a lot of indie game devs because at that time, around 2012, 2013, that was like the time of indie games on Kickstarter.
Yeah.
And through events and things like that, I ended up meeting a lot of people in the industry. But even back then, I had no idea that I would end up doing that either, even though I have always loved video games. Luke Crane, who was the head of games at Kickstarter at the time, and also a pretty renowned tabletop game designer. For some reason, even though games wasn't my official category, he would pull me along to games events. And later on, he told me, he was like, I always knew you were going to be a game designer. I could see the darkness in you, like the brain disease or whatever that makes someone want to make video games. So I had a wonderful time meeting a lot of people in the industry, learning about all sorts of projects. And also my job was telling people how to communicate about their creative projects online. But I felt like I wanted to make creative things too. I didn't know exactly what form, what exact type of projects I wanted to make, but I knew I wanted to make things. And so I was really drawn to this graduate program at NYU called ITP, which is just a really amazing place where you just do lots of experimental stuff with technology, hardware, software, all sorts of things. So I went and I fell in love with coding as soon as I got there. And then I made the True Love Tinder robot in my first semester as kind of the final project for my intro to coding class, basically in my intro to physical computing class. I cheated by making one final for two classes, but and that project, I was really proud of it. I thought it was a good project, but I wasn't like overthinking it at the time. I just came up with the idea in a dream. I thought it'd be cool. I made it, and then I made a GIF of it and I put it on Twitter, and then it went viral. And then I started getting emails from journalists wanting to interview me about it, like tons of them suddenly. And I was like, oh shit.
Graduate student Nicole He created the True Love Tinder robot as a final project in New York University's Interactive Telecommunications program.
It basically measures how excited you're getting. Something changes in your body, whether or not you realize it, as we react to things that we're looking at or things that are happening to us.
The robot runs
a lot of things that I had learned at my job at Kickstarter, which was about communicating about your creative work online. There were lessons I learned from telling other people how to do it. So that night when it went viral, I stayed up all night and I made a personal website. I made an artist statement about the piece. And then the day after, then I started talking to the journalists about the project and sharing the link of my statement or whatever. And then a lot of the journalists who are, I guess, typical bloggers also, they would just literally copy and paste what I said about it. But then it's interesting because it's like that project became more than just my final project for class. It became almost more real because there were people talking about it and thinking about it. And that was sort of an experience, maybe my first experience where that was not technically a game, but it was an experience where I made a creative piece and people were engaging with it and talking about it. And that was exciting for me. And I was invited to show it at places around the world and stuff. And so that kicked off my path of making things like that in grad school. And after I got a job at Google on a team called the Creative Lab, where I worked as a creative technologist, making weird art experimental things,
Right.
I ended up focusing on doing a lot of things with voice technology. So that kind of became my specialty, doing experimental things with computers that you talk to. And so back to that project, Enhance.computer, I was actually commissioned that piece for an exhibition in Melbourne with Robert Yang and Zach Gage. We got to do this really cool thing where there was a really cool bar in Melbourne called Bar SK. So I made that project. And then also the secret Dunny box, which is the toilet project. But I just made it for that. I put it out there. And one thing that kind of blew my mind was like later on, I discovered that Twitch streamers had found it. And this was like 2018. So it wasn't,
Right.
I was not so aware of what Twitch was at that time, actually. And I think it was also just less in the culture at that time. And I found videos of people playing it, including that guy, I guess, Germa. I was like, who is this guy? Like, why? I was like,
really?
He played it, like, that game lasts like 30 seconds, right? It's like a 30-second game. He played it for like an hour and a half somehow.
Zoom in. Zoom in. Enhance.
Was that something, because it's sort of come up twice now as well as an affirming moment? Is that something that is sort of critically important to your process? Is watching people, maybe not even from just like an artistically gratifying perspective, but just from it being compelling and interesting and informative? Like, is that critical to your work? Is actually seeing people interact with it because the nature of it being interactive, I guess?
It became a motivation or a creative goal for me because, again, with like the True Love Tinder robot, I did get to see some people actually go through the experience, which is cool. But most of the project really lived in the internet, like retweets, people talking about it, people like YouTube videos about the thing, and not like in doing the thing, right? Because it was an extremely flimsy, broken thing. Because it was a student project, it was my first project, right? So I found myself sort of feeling ambitious towards making the type of work that actually asked for that deeper engagement, that asked for people to not just look at it on Twitter and be like, that's a cool project, but to play it and give me real feedback about it too. Like, they could also say that they didn't like it for that reason. Because I never really had that before, right? Because it's kind of a small thing. People look at it, they're like, it's cool. I mean, it's not like I'm out here looking for people to yell at me or tell me I'm bad or something like that. But I think there is an aspect to that which is really amazing that game designers get to experience. I mean, not to be screamed at by gamers, like that's bad, but they scream at you because they care so much.
Right.
They care too much, to be honest.
Whenever somebody, especially in, I guess, 2024, where there are sort of codified pipelines for how people get into games development, I'm always very interested when in this modern era, we see people approach it from a different perspective. Like, Disco Elysium and Robert Kurvitz and them, like they were not game designers. They were making something different and then realized that that's how they wanted to express their art. And honestly, you go back to the 80s and 90s and there are stories everywhere about people stumbling into the work from some accidentally. What's so special about it? Because NYU has a really good games design.
Yeah.
You mentioned Robert Yang. We interviewed him years ago about his involvement in Black Mesa. I'd love to do a documentary on Hard Lads someday.
Oh, absolutely. They have an ad in the Crush House, by the way. Hard Lads.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Fantastic. I haven't seen it yet. What do you think the journey that you've taken, what freedom do you think that gives you that maybe you wouldn't have got if you hadn't gone to journalism initially and had just jumped into his computer science major?
I think it's because maybe I'm old. I mean, I'm not that old, but if I were younger, this path would have been more clear, right? Or more like, oh, actually being a video game designer is a job. First of all, that's not something I even thought about or really knew, even though I loved playing games growing up and everything, right? In the 2000s era or whatever, the 90s, 2000s, it's sort of like, here are games made by companies, and that's, I don't know, they just come out of but especially with the boom of like indie games over the last 15 years or something, and then a more diverse set of people were more visibly making games and making that a career. And so I didn't grow up with that, and so I didn't really see that as something that was even possible. So I think that was maybe part of it. If I were younger and maybe I was like, oh, I like video games, what should I do with my life? Oh, there are schools that teach that now as a major, and here are other people that I see as visible people in the space that I. So anyway, so I think because of this, that's part of the reason why maybe I didn't go through a traditional path. I'm grateful for my path because I do often wonder, like even the fact that I fell in love with coding, I actually love coding so much that I think I would be actually very happy as like a normal software engineer. Like if that were my job, just making like banking software or something. I love the craft of coding so much. I think I would enjoy it. Of course, I do think it's better. I love it more to get to be a game director, but like I almost feel like I got lucky that I didn't, because I discovered it via art school, and I also love doing creative work. So having those two things come together in this particular way, I wonder if I would have ended up in the same place or not.
Well, it's amazing that you had both the moment where you realized that there was a process that you enjoyed, which was coding, right? And that also you found a creative voice or maybe output or audience that felt satisfying sort of at the same moment. I'm interested in how you made that choice though, because you said that like, okay, you're working at Kickstarter, you're getting introduced to game devy people, but it's not like you just like opened Unity. You ended up going into like what sounds like a very particular type of course. So were there signs? Were there things that you were sort of flirting with or interested in, but you hadn't sort of made the leap? Was there anything that was sort of magnetizing you towards that?
Yeah. So there's a particular thing when I was working at Kickstarter. So do you know this game, Killer Queen?
I don't think so.
Killer Queen Arcade, for those of you who don't know, is a 5-on-5 arcade game created by Josh DeBonis and Nick Mikros in 2013. 2 teams of 5 players compete against each other to be the first to accomplish one of 3 different victory conditions on a map.
It's an incredible game. I think it's like a perfect video game, extremely well balanced, very fun, and it was a project that originally launched on Kickstarter. Now they have cabinets like all over the place, and we had one of the first cabinets in the world, just in the office. It's a very tech company type of thing.
And last life
on gold. Oh, and gold is white.
Oh, there it is in a catch. P-Wong taking out Woody. Wow.
So a lot of us were really obsessed with playing Killer Queen, but the cabinet was downstairs and everyone worked upstairs. And because it's a 10-player game, you kind of like need to get people to like come and play. But if people knew there was a game going, they would immediately come down. So it was like, well, we have this problem where like we need a way to communicate that someone wants to start a game. Someone needs to make a giant button or something that you press to like notify the Killer Queen heads in the office that a game is starting. And I was like saying this and hoping someone would just do that. And of course, no one did. So I was like, okay, I'll do it. I don't know how. Like, I didn't know how to do anything like that. I had no idea how to start. But actually, one of my coworkers, Nick, knew how to do this stuff actually because he went to ITP. Like, he was an alum and he knew he had these skills of doing microcontrollers and things like that. So he helped me. I'm very gracious for this. He helped me make this button. So it's a giant button that you press and it would just tweet out from an account that a game was starting, and then people would just subscribe to the notifications of that account, and then they would come down. When I made that button, well, really when Nick made it, but like he taught me how to make this button, I was like, I want to do stuff like this. But like that was so cool. Obviously, it was not useful in an actual way. I'm sure it actually tanked the productivity of Kickstarter dramatically. I just like loved that experience. Again, I think those were the signs of like doing the technical thing and then the creative thing and then ending up with something that was like fun. That was like the first thing. And that actually, I think, was a catalyst for me then deciding I wanted to apply to ITP.
One of the things I love about your website is you can really see the sort of creative journey that you've gone on. What is it about these later projects? Presumably these are a lot of the ones that you did under the banner of Google. What about those were maybe not enough that you have sort of gone towards video games in the more traditional sense?
Yeah, so I actually really loved my job at Google. I worked at the Creative Lab, as I said, and my job was extremely cool, getting to do like basically lots of really experimental stuff, really playful stuff, compared to maybe some people who just get to work on like the tiniest corner of Google Docs or something. It's like what I got to do was really cool.
Creative Lab is a really interesting place to work as a creative technologist because we get to do a lot of things that are kind of experimental and prototypey, and we do a bunch of projects that are often open source, so it's either kind of teaching other developers how to use specific new Google technologies, or oftentimes it's something like maybe teaching a more general audience about how AI works with a project that's fun and approachable.
But I just had this feeling like I just didn't want all of my creative output to be owned by the corporation at that point in my life. Of course, there was a limitation to the kinds of things that you could do, even though they were extremely cool and you had like infinite resources. I just remember actually one of the wildest things that I got to make there, I think it's on my website, it was this like game called what do we call it? AIO. It was like a machine learning before the word was AI, I always called it machine learning game where two players would train models on their own voices making animal sounds. And then there's this insane installation piece where then you would have to make the animal sounds into microphones, and it would cause these like little cars to race down this physical track full of like farm animals and things all around.
It almost looks like a kid's toy, kind of like a kid's little train set or something.
It was, that project was insane. But anyway, so we made that project. I can't believe it was still like wow, they spent a bunch of money on that. And then we showed it at this conference, which is a really like developer conference. And I was just like standing there and hearing people talk about it or reading articles about it later, and they're like, Google made this thing called AIO. And I'm like,
right, yes.
Yeah. But like, so I kind of was feeling like, it's not like, oh, I need to have personal glory. That's why I wanted to do my own thing. But I just felt like if I was going to trade off owning my own creative output for really money and stability in a job, that's not to say I would never make that trade. But particularly at that point in my life, I felt like I was ready to step out and try to do my own thing and just try to make weird shit on my own, and specifically go into try to make video games, because I also found the idea, maybe this is like an insane thing to first, other game designers might have a different perspective on this, but I found the idea of needing to sell something that you make as actually a really compelling creative constraint and challenge too, because I'd never done that before. So I decided to try to do that, which was maybe a bad idea, but here I am now.
That's fascinating. I would assume that most people who have been in the trenches of selling their art would actually want the other.
Exactly. I think it's like a grass is greener type of thing. But the thing is, like, when you're making work in creative technology, you can make extremely cool projects, or you can make things that are ride the line between creative tech or games, or the same thing. Usually what you're making is advertising, because that's where the money is. That's how the funding model works for that industry, is that a company is paying you to get to make a cool thing because it serves as advertising. Whereas like in games or typical commercial games, of course it's complicated with publishers, etc., but essentially you're just selling a product, right? So there's just different like pros and cons on a creative perspective of each side. And so having been on the side of like, I was getting to do cool projects, did it matter actually how good they were? Not really. I'm getting paid either way. If they see it or they don't see it, there's no measure of success. So I was really interested in the other side. Like,
right.
What if I had to make something that people really liked? Like I had to try to do that. What would that be like?
I want to talk to you about Crush House in a second, but I don't get to talk to somebody who worked in creative tech all that often. And it's just brought up a question in my head just now that I'd love to ask you. Sort of in 2024 at the moment, it almost seems like we're past a point in games where there was a lot of really interesting hardware, driving the games, like, the Wiimote, the Nintendo DS, maybe even Kinect, definitely Rock Band.
Yeah.
Like, stuff like the Rock Band DS game. I always remember when I worked at GameStop and we used to sell that thing. It was such somebody had to make that peripheral just for the DS version of Rock Band. I was thinking, or Guitar Hero, I think it might have been. Do you have a perspective on that? Do you think that is there technological innovation happening within games in a different way, or are we sort of in a bit, coming down the other side of the bell curve on that stuff?
Yeah, I feel like it is a shame. It seems like currently in the game industry, obviously things are not going great at this particular moment in time, right? We're in a very conservative era. And so even things that were more experimental with hardware in the past do really feel like a different time. And actually, recently, I was hanging out with my friend, Doug Wilson, who made JS Joust. Do you know that game as part of Sports Friends? Yeah. And actually, we played it recently for the first time for me in a long time. And it was just reminded of, it feels like a different era of doing interesting video games with interesting hardware. And I just hope that we can somehow go back to that type of thing. I mean, I guess the reality is that maybe the people are doing interesting work in this area more on a small scale, right, or very local scale or experimental scale. Like, will it ever reach the large commercial scale that these older projects had? I don't know. And doesn't need to. I also don't know. Maybe just cool to have like your local artist doing interesting work. I mean, I would love it. I would love to see more interesting hardware.
Okay, on to Crush House. As I mentioned before, Crush House is a collaboration between Nicole and the developer Nerial, with their parent company Devolver Digital publishing. The game takes place in first person, with the player producing a reality TV show. What does that involve? Well, choosing the cast, buying new items for the house, and most importantly, satisfying the show's various audiences with shots of whatever they want. Some of the folks watching want to see drama, others want to see plants, or butts, or want you to film the action like a film student, or worse, a voyeur. It's an incredibly unique concept that likely had to go through a lot of nipping and tucking to get to where it is today. So where did the original concept for Crush House come from, and how much has it changed over the course of its development? Let's talk about the Crush House. So first of all, I'm just fascinated as to the makeup of the team working on it, because this is a project that is happening between you, Nerial, is that the name of the?
Nerial, yeah.
Nerial and Devolver Digital. Are you independent? Did they hire you as a game director and this is the studio working on? How does it work?
Yeah, it's an unusual situation. So, so I'm not part of Nerial. So they are a studio based mostly in the UK, but also France.
Cool.
And the reason all of this happened was because at a GDC a few years ago, I met Arnaud Debach, who made the Rain series at Nerial and Pikuniku and Card Shark. And so he was with Nerial at the time. And sort of we started, just talking about collaboration, and actually tried prototyping with him and then his collaborator, Remy Debach on Pikuniku. They had this prototype idea and I joined in that. And that idea never came together. Like, that was something that didn't really happen. But at the same time, Arnaud and I were particularly obsessed with this particular reality show called Terrace House, which is a Japanese show on Netflix. And then we were like, the brainwave was, what if we make a game that's about reality TV? So that's sort of how it started. Sort of this was like for Arnaud separate from, like, on the side from his like Nerial stuff.
Okay.
And we were doing prototyping and like thinking about this idea. Then eventually realized that if we were going to make this game, it was a bigger project than like a couple people. At some point we were like, what if we could make a Playdate game or something? But it became clear as we started to prototype and think about it, like it was going to be a bigger game. So what we decided is that if we were going to sign the game with Devolver, then we were going to bring on all of his team at Nerial. And so that's what happened. And Arnaud has since left the project. And so that's how I ended up being solo independent director of this game with Nerial. But yeah, long story short, that's sort of why this is the case. But yeah, it is admittedly a sort of strange situation here.
I've had the opportunity to play the Crush House. I think by the time this is up, people either can or will be able to very soon. How much has that initial idea, the seed of it, changed to the version that we now play today?
In a lot of ways, it's changed a lot, but in other ways, it was the original idea. So The first decision was that it was a reality game and that you would play as the producer. Like you wouldn't play as a contestant, you play as the person behind the scenes. That was sort of the original concept. But it wasn't so much like the idea changed, and more like we took this large idea and sort of refined it down to the details of what it is now. But there are some core game design iterations that we had over the process, because if you played the game, you know the core game mechanic is quite unique. Like it's something we invented. And that took a lot of iteration and work.
I want to talk about that because as somebody who films people for a living, it's always fun to play a game that is that takes your job and sort of creates.
I'm sure it's extremely accurate to your job.
Well, actually, I remember the first time I like focused on somebody and gave it a bit of a Dutch tilt, and it gave me the what would you even call it?
The film students.
Yes.
Yeah.
The film students sort of bonus or whatever.
Yeah.
I thought that was quite sweet. You know, to me, I always find it funny when people talking about games like walking simulators and stuff like that is this branch from the first person shooters. And I've always loved when there are games that aren't about shooting, but to a certain extent are using the same design rules as first person shooters, which is you are pointing your viewpoint in a certain direction. And that's the sort of the goal of it. Was it always like a 3D first person game? Because I could see you doing this in almost like The Sims or something, you know?
Right. Yeah. So, so first of all, our tagline or our genre that we call the game is reality TV thirst person shooter.
Nice.
It was always a 3D game. We decided to do that. But actually, it took a while to get to the point of deciding that it was going to be a first person game where you're running around the house. Our first iteration was like almost an isometric view where you're like maybe getting to pick between different cameras to see what was happening. And actually, the core game design was really different too, because the idea from the beginning was that you would be like capturing footage during the day and then at nighttime going down to like edit your episode at your computer.
That would have been too much for me. Like I can take the shooting. I don't want to do the editing in a game.
Yeah. The problems with our early prototypes of the game for a very long time, a very, very long time, was that it was boring. The first problem we had was like, okay, you pick the camera to get the angle or whatever, and you go into the room, and then you had this like map with a bird's eye view of the house, and you could click on the room to see the conversation, then you could pick the camera angle. But then you're like just watching a conversation. And we're kind of like, well, it's a little boring, especially when we didn't even have like animations and stuff. You're just like, I'm literally just watching whatever, kind of nothing, and it's kind of boring. So we were like, okay, just as an experiment, what would it be like if it was first person? Like, what if I'm running around? And trying that out, it was immediately like, this is way better. Like, it's really cool actually to get to run around and kind of decide your angle of filming and everything. So that was one pivot. It was clearly the right idea. But the other pivot where we switched to this live streaming model was, again, because of the thing where like, you're just capturing footage all day, which in the game is like a 6 to 8 to 10 minute cycle of just filming. And then you get to edit the episode, and then you would like pick the clips, and then you would order them or whatever, and then audience would react. It's actually still, I think, a cool idea. But the problem that we had was like, the player was getting like no feedback during the day. So you're just filming, and it was the same problem as before. You're like, I'm just watching a conversation. And also at that time, our conversations were not very good. It was really later on when we really spiced it up that became better. But even so, like it's like, what am I doing? The game is not really active enough. And I didn't want to make like a visual novel type of game where you're purely reading conversations. Like I wanted there to be really like active gameplay. So yeah, we decided to try this idea of live streaming instead. No editing anymore, just getting comments in real time from the audience, having to read those comments, figure out what they want to see, and then capture that footage in real time became the gameplay pivot. And it still took us a lot of iterations to get to how we score things and all that stuff to make it work. But those are sort of the major things. And beyond that, also just the tone of the game. So our writers, Daisy, Phil, and Oscar did such an incredible job with writing the dialogue that exists now, which is very funny and kind of over the top reality stuff. that was also a pivot because earlier it was a bit too boring. So we just sort of tried, like, boringness was a huge problem that we had early on, and we did a lot to try to get to the other side.
Yeah, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but when I was playing the game, at a certain point, I'd like played nonstop for like an hour, and I was like, why am I not getting bored of this? Because all I'm doing is like basically walking around, deciding how to view what is essentially a day that I have absolutely no agency over what actually anyone does. I can't interact with these people. Well, I can't influence them in the moment. So then I started to like analyze like what I was doing, and I realized that, there's, all this interesting stuff with like how I'm framing the shots, of course, which I really like. But then it's sort of like all the different plates that you're spinning. You're obviously looking at the different audiences, you're watching them, you're also listening to the conversations yourself. Did all that stuff sort of come together? You said there was a lot of iteration in that coming together. When did it click for you that it wasn't going to be boring? Because as you said, like when you're layering that stuff in, it must be when there's no animation, when there's no, the text isn't quite there yet. You haven't got all that juice, the nice animations. How did you sort of trust the process that you would get to a point?
I will say it took a very long time to get to that point. And actually, we had almost the opposite problem, or both problems at the same time for a while, because when we switched all this stuff, we're like, okay, that's the right decision. But then we had versions where there was too much information on screen, like way faster comments, way more like just gauges of things showing up in like audience numbers and stuff like that. At some point we had like an actual number that was like going up with the audience. And then we had the opposite problem where it's like, the opposite, it's not like it was too interesting. It was more like it was too confusing and complicated and hard to understand. And it was still boring. So, but then it was just like, we were clearly headed though in the right direction. So we kind of honed in on the thing. And, when did it actually click? I actually think that it was pretty recent. Like I had faith, and I think the team had faith that it would all come together. But the Crush House is very much a game where it's like everything comes together at the end and then it works. Right. And you just we had to have faith that was going to happen, because I could like picture it in my mind. It's like when we do have all the animations, when the dialogue is really punched up, when the audience stuff and the players getting the UI feedback properly, like then it's going to be great. But of course, it just took a really long time to get there. And so I will say it was pretty recent. I had faith that it would happen, and I'm glad it did, but it finally really did pretty recently.
I want to talk about the writing a little bit as well, or ask you about it, because there was a couple of things that stood out to me. Number one is that obviously you have to write quite a lot, because there's all of these different, is there 12 characters in total you can choose from? And so there's all the different combinations of who you decide to put in the house. But then also you have to be quite economical with not just the amount of text on screen, but also the length of the conversations themselves. Was that tricky for the writing team to sort of find that, like create these conversations that feel like they're, have an arc to them, but you don't have that much real estate sort of text wise to pull it off?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 12 cast members. You pick 4 at a time. If you do the math, that's 495 possible cast combinations. And so early on, actually, this is even just like the first week of thinking about this project, I knew it had to be a procedural game in some ways. Like it wasn't going to be a linear narrative game, at least not on the basic level of the reality TV stuff that was happening. And so we spent a long time with the team building out the fundamental reality TV simulation system that runs underneath. And it did take a lot of trial and error with the writers to come up with what made sense. Originally, we had a structure where they would write out like, say, a 3-act storyline of something that could happen between a couple characters. You would have a bunch of those, and then maybe, but they would play out at different times. And so you could see part A happen here, then maybe the next day part B would happen. But what we found with that, it was actually too specific. And so what we pivoted to, and this was, I think, a really clever idea and approach from Francois, from Muriel, was instead to write more modular little scenes that were truly based on people's relationships and their attractions to each other, as well as their traits. So instead of writing like a 3-part story about people fighting over like cooking or something like that. It was more like, okay, we're going to write a bunch of different scenes that could happen between friends. In some of those scenes, they become lovers. In some of them, they become enemies. And what determines that could be their attraction levels to each other or their personality traits. So we wrote these like modular things where there are variations within those little scenes too. But that's what really is like the building blocks of all the narrative. And what was really cool is that when it all came together, there is that like emergent narrative feeling that happens where you're like, well, these two, like Alex and Gunther, were fighting earlier about margaritas. And that's why Alex is upset at Gunther in this next scene where he's talking about hooking up with Priscilla, or, whatever it is.
Right.
And it's like, that's not how it works, obviously. Or like, I understand how it works. That's not exactly how it works. But even I can't help but like start to form those storylines in my mind. And so, our writing team, Daisy, who's like the senior narrative designer and writer at Nereal's side. And then we brought on Phil, who is a really incredible writer and also just like a comedy person. They really did all of the dialogue, and then plus Oscar from Nereal as well. So they did all of the writing that's in the game and did such an incredible job, especially after a number of pivots that we had to do.
It also, sort of creates this meta game, at least for me it did, and I'm sure it did for other people. And I'm interested in how sort of conscious you were of this, where you end up sort of playing each season like a matchmaker, you know what I mean? Where, it's sort of, I guess it does actually contribute to your success rate in some ways, but also just on a purely personal level, I wanted to create matchups where people got on with each other more, I guess.
Yeah.
Was that something intentional as well in the design?
It was, yeah. I mean, we had to have enough. There is enough of this like RNG thing going on that we had to have a spread of possible like things that could always happen in every day. But it's true that what the system allows for is that like the cast members all have personality traits and attractions, and so certain characters will typically have patterns with each other, even if there's variation and a bit of randomness. Sometimes it's like Alex and Emil are extremely incompatible. So like if you cast them together, they're likely to fight and they will almost never kiss. Maybe will never kiss. No one has seen it yet. And so I think that is the type of thing where especially if you're like replaying the game or something, you kind of learn those patterns and you can also have that fun meta game. But it does become part of it because you're like, okay, for various reasons, I need to capture footage of this person kissing now. And so I'm like, based on who I think they could be attracted to, who will I cast for the season with them?
Tell me about the characters then. Did you always have 12? How much did they change? Was there any ones that got cut? Was there any ones that had big changes to them?
We actually always had 12. And I think overall they all got punched up. So early versions of them were just a little too bland. And then I think Daisy did a particularly great job of taking these characters and really figuring out what are their personality flaws, like what's wrong with all these people, and punching those things up and making those very clear. And then, she and Phil really took that and ran with it with how they wrote each of their lines and stuff. We actually had one particular character, Gunther, who is just like a fan favorite, like team favorite.
Is he the contrarian?
Yes.
He's big fan of him.
Yeah. he was like such a good character, and our like Redditor type of guy that we were like, Gunther's so good that what we need to do is like make all the other characters as good as Gunther in their own ways, right? The kind of character that you like love to hate, but then also you feel maybe a bit of tenderness towards them as well for certain reasons. And so they all basically got like a glow up and a punch up in the process.
What about the audiences? Because what I love about the audience is that some of them are based on, to a certain extent, they're all based on what's in front of you, but some of them are based on how everyone's interacting, and then other people just want to see plants or butts. How did you land on those ones? Was there any other ones that got left on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, we had the process of designing the audiences was really fun. We had to kind of approach it from a few angles. So one is just like, what are audiences that you would maybe expect to see or expect to imagine watching a reality show?
Wine moms.
Wine moms being one. Yeah. Just regular reality TV fans being another. And then some of our like, what are things that we have in the house that we can like create an audience around. So we have an audience called the Ferologists, which is apparently a word for like people who like lighthouses. Because I was like, well, how do we get the player to film a lighthouse? And I was like, what is a lighthouse liker called? And then it was like, Ferologists, that's an audience in our game. But we also, right, so like as you mentioned, we also had to kind of spread the audiences around in gameplay terms as far as like what type of thing they were asking you to film, because some of them are really like environmental object focused, like the landscaping lovers like to see plants, but we didn't want it to be too much like that where you're just filming the environment the whole time. Some of them want to see specific like cast specific things, so body parts. So we have the butt guys, famous audience. We also have foot fans later in the season, and then we have like the crush fans who are kind of your tutorial audience that just like to see the cast. Those are audiences that like point you just towards the cast members. However, we also have audiences who want to see specific content. So the sexy seekers want to see sexy stuff like kissing and things like that. Drama queens want to see drama. Schadenfreuders want to see cringe. We wanted to do that, and we tried to make it so that every day you have at least one of those audiences, or the wholesome who want to see wholesome stuff, because that also encourages the player to actually pay attention to the conversations that are happening between the cast members and to capture a moment. You're like, oh, this seems to be like maybe a sexy leaning conversation. I should follow this so that I could capture the sexy stuff. So those are the types of considerations that we had when coming up with all of these different types of audiences. Then we tried to design most of the days. There is a bit of like RNG in especially the later seasons when you have like 8 audiences at once.
Right.
But we try to balance it so that you have this type of combination of all of these things. And so and also, yeah, again, some of them want you to film things in specific ways. So like the film students, as we mentioned earlier, like to see Dutch angles and stuff. We're just trying to get you to like have all these different considerations in mind to be trying to satisfy all of them at the same time.
Talking a lot about the sort of moment to moment in the game. I'm not going to get into it, but there is something going on sort of under the hood, as it were, as well. How tricky has it been to like talk about this game without talking about some of the interesting elements that might exist within the game?
Yeah, that's sort of like a marketing challenge, right? Because we wanted to indicate that there was more to the game than that surface level reality TV stuff. There was like a larger story and a bit of gameplay associated with that and a narrative without giving away what's going on or what you have to do, but also without trying to set expectations as well as far as like what type of thing it could be. So yeah, I just sort of like hint at it, and the reaction is always really strong to that too. I think we found that different people obviously like want to play this game for different reasons, but a good number of them are interested in it because of the mystery aspect, especially if they're not just like reality TV fanatics.
How are you feeling, pretty close to launch on this one?
Yeah, it's wild. It's a wild time for me because we're like about a week out, and this is my first time, as we've been talking about, doing a project like this, the biggest thing I've ever done. That's my project. I have so many emotions that I can't even get into, but I'm feeling really good about the game. Like, I'm really proud of the work that we did. The team has been amazing, and I'm really proud of it. And I think people will like it, or at least some people will like it. And so, yeah, it's a wild time.
Yeah, is it tricky? Because I've really enjoyed the game, and I think it ticks a lot of boxes for me personally, which is that I really, I'm 38 now. I've been playing games for a long time. Anything that is new and novel and interesting that I've not played before immediately sort of shoots up, and then just like there's a lot of polish on this, like the graphics, the design, the feeling of the moment to moment. The writing is really strong. Like, it feels like a very well made game. the thing that I always think about in 2024 is that there are so many really strong indie games coming out all the time. It's like,
Absolutely.
it's such a, such an odd time. Does that sort of, in the back of your head as well, it just being, hopefully with Devolver, you think at least at the very least they've got some marketing, cachet behind them. So maybe you get over that initial hump that a lot of games seem to struggle with.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it sort of like remains to be seen what launch will go like. And Devolver has been amazing. It's incredible to work with them and their marketing team in particular. But it is a challenge because our game is different. It's unique, and it's also kind of, in some ways, really hard to communicate what the game actually is, right, beyond the premise. I think that's been one of our challenges, is also that I think our core audience are going to be people who are not necessarily the type of people who like read gaming news or something like that, right? Or follow the traditional, very video gamey type of stuff. I feel like our audience, I mean, not all our audience, but a large part of our audience are people who maybe play games because like their friends mention something, or maybe an influencer. So we're actually going to do a big marketing push related to influencers. So we'll see how that goes. I think it's one of the challenges. Like I am very proud of the fact that our game is unique and different and hasn't there are a lot of things that like are similar, maybe thematically, or have some similarities to ours, but I think our game is really unique. And but in 2024, you're right. Like I think that's a good thing, but also it's a challenge because again, I feel like we're in this like very conservative time, is from both the industry, like where the money is, but also from the player's perspective too. I think there are, of course, a lot of people out there, myself included, who really seek uniqueness or weirdness in games. But I also get the feeling that it's also like people are not always open to something that they don't already know.
Yeah, absolutely. Time will tell, I guess. A week prior to launch, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. So best of luck with launch.
Thank you.
I'm excited to see all my favorite streamers playing it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be I think streamers, it's a good streaming game. So I think that'll be good.
Massive thanks to Nicole He for talking to me for this week's episode. You can pick up Crush House on Steam for PC and Mac right now. Huge thanks to show producer Jesse Garasha for turning this episode around so quickly, and to you for listening. And seeing as we're now on the NoClip main podcast feed, we could always use some fresh reviews. So if you fancy helping out the show, please give us a rating on your podcast app of choice. And if you have any suggestions for games or developers you'd like to hear on this show, hit me up on Twitter @DannyO'Dwyer or spam me directly on the NoClip Patreon Discord. Until next time.